Hi folks, Lou here, and I'm going to talk about how in tanks at least, military tanks, size does matter. Why don't we have really huge tanks? Well, of course, in World War II, we had light tanks and medium tanks and heavy tanks, and they served different purposes. But nowadays, we have main battle tanks, MBTs, and they're sort of jacks of all trade. Below them, we have infantry fighting vehicles, and we have the occasional thing like the French vehicle that has 8 very large tires, but otherwise behaves a lot like a light tank. Nonetheless, there are still limits to the size of a tank, and I'm going to talk about why, and then try to apply that to games. Now, first of all, consider the possibility of soft ground. We see this in Ukraine, where at certain times near winter, not in the depth of winter or depth of winter, there are lots of rain, and it's warm enough that the fields turn into mud, very deep mud, that even tanks cannot negotiate well, let alone wheeled vehicles. But there can be soft ground anywhere, anytime. And if a tank is too big, it might have problems with that. Now, of course, you can make the tank treads wider, and that reduces the ground pressure per square inch. But if a tank gets too big, that's just not going to help. Even more important are bridges. There are lots of rivers and streams everywhere that tanks are not going to be able to wade through or go on the river bottom and so on. They've got to have some help to get across the river, and that's a bridge. And yet bridges often are not made for very heavy objects. And if you've driven around in the United States, you've often seen uh, places where there's a bridge, often over quite a small body of water, that says that there's a tonnage limit. If your vehicle weighs more than that limit, you don't go on that bridge because it's dangerous. Well, you can imagine tanks that weigh 100 tons or 200 tons. There are going to be a great many bridges that they're just not going to support, especially in less developed areas. So really, really big tanks become, if not impractical, certainly less practical. Then we have the roads themselves. In the United States, we're accustomed to hard paved roads that most of the time will take a lot of weight. Although there are some where you're limited, you're not allowed to have 8-axle vehicles or something like that. Well, tanks are a lot heavier than a normal vehicle. In case you're not aware, a car tends to be about 2 tons. And even a pickup truck is only 2.5 tons. And of course, semis weigh more, but none of them weigh anything like the weight of a big tank. And again, for reference, main battle tanks these days are somewhere between 50 and 70 tons or even more. So if your tanks are too heavy, then they're going to either chop up the roads or not be able to use them at all, depending. Now, why is this important? I'll go through more, but why is this important? Well, there are 3 characteristics for tanks. There's their attack capabilities, their defense capabilities, which is partly armor and partly other things, and their mobility. And if you take one of those away, the tank's not going to be worth much. If you take the mobility of the tank away, it might be good for defense. You could set it up, hull down, and so on, but you can't do much of anything else with it. So roads are important. Railroads are even more important in some respects. If you want to take a tank a long way, you're going to put it on a railroad. And once again, if you have a very, very large tank, then you're going to need special railroad cars and perhaps special railroad tracks. Consider also the possibility that you need to put the tank in a ship. In World War II, Sherman tanks were not the largest and not the greatest, but they fit very well in ships. So they could be shipped from the United States to Britain and Russia and other places where they could be used in warfare. If they had been made as very big tanks, then that would have been a big problem. Now, how should this be represented in games? Well, for example, I play an old video game called Empire Deluxe Enhanced Edition, and tanks can't even go into the mountains unless engineers have built roads through those mountains. And in similar ways, tank mobility can be limited, and that limits one of those three characteristics that you have to determine when you're creating a tank or any other unit for that matter: attack, defense, and mobility. So tanks that can do anything that infantry can do, in effect, are reducing the value of the infantry, and they are posing fewer problems for the player of the game. And remember, a commercial war game is much more about generalship than it is about real warfare. So from the point of view of, well, it doesn't really represent real warfare, we could ignore that tanks have problems in certain terrain. But for generalship purposes, we want to represent that problem for the commander. So size does matter, but in this case, huge is not best because the mobility is so limited that you don't get anything near the value you should out of that huge vehicle. And that's what happened to the Germans late in World War II with some of their Ferdinands and other very large tanks. They were just too big to be practical. They were cool, but they were a waste. Thanks for listening.